Let's take a look at 1860 Railways on the Isle of Wight. This is an interesting game from my perspective, because it does kind of form its own little sub-branch. I guess you could say that about some of the other more innovative and newer, like the Deep Thought designs. Some of them are their own little branch too. And this is almost in that sort of sense. So normally I stick to what strictly is the 1830 family. I've played a couple of exceptions in my videos. I've done 1835, which I feel kind of tempers a lot of the 1830isms in it. And I've played 1853, which also, and 53 is there. I don't know where I've got 35. Oh, there's 35. And of course Baltimore and Ohio next to it, which is almost similar to an XX game, although more of a winsome nature. Okay. And that's a brand. It's the company that made it. This one kind of scared me away for a few reasons. One is it has what's basically a one-dimensional stock track. Not quite, but kind of tricky in the sense that it is. And I've played the 1829, I think 1829 various, one of the variants, the northern game of it. And I really didn't like how that played out, but that was a very early design. And I've always been kind of iffy about 53, which kind of went off the 30 rails. 35 I never liked very much. So I've always felt like I'm into these really harsh, ability to dump companies, etc. And this doesn't seem to have that nature, but it does have a lot of interesting new features to it that I think may make for a... Oh, sorry. Got something in my mouth. A bit of lime. May make for a competitive game in a different sort of way that's still appealing to me. I'm not saying 35 is an unappealing game to everyone. It's not. It's definitely a competitive game. It's just it lacks features that I like in an 18XX game. This game has enough differences in the rules that I'm going to mostly go through the rules and kind of give my impressions of what's different and what's new to me. Okay. So to begin with, I'm using the second edition, and it appears that I have the right map. The other side of the board has another map on it. I don't know if you can kind of see that. That's the original map, in case you want to play with that. They suggest the original map for 2 to 3 players and the bigger, slightly expanded map for 3 to 4 players. Interesting thing here. An 18XX game designed for 2 players. My opinion of XX has been, in general, 4 players is even a bit weak in most of the games that I play. So I'm kind of curious to see how one that's designed to actually hold no more than 4 is going to handle the play. Or at least my tastes in it. Some tiles to be removed if you're playing the different game. We have some terrain issues to bring up here. Let's talk about some of these. Okay. Normal towns are going to be the big circle. The mountains are extra cost areas. These little doinkers here are your little towns that you can visit. Let me see. These red things are impassable barriers. They're going to be, I think, a problem in the game. As you start putting tiles on the map, they're going to maybe disappear because I'm used to XX tiles kind of connecting to each other pretty closely. That could be kind of problematic because you can't build track across them, but there could be track building in both directions from it. Some of them are not particularly for a good reason that you can't build track through them, except that nobody bothered, for example, to build a bridge in one case. Here there was actually an estate that they forced the railways to transport across, and in one place there's a mountain ridge or a hilly ridge that was too extensive to cross. But this one, it's the river, and the truth is that if you made it a hex cost, it wouldn't reflect the reality well, which is normal for XX. You'd have to actually have a specific cost for crossing the river, and that would require additional rolls. And since it never was done, they left that alone. Why is this here? Okay. 5 of these? Oh, this is Fishburne that goes over here. Let's see what else we have here. This is a place to put these cards, but I'm not using them there. There is more. There's doinkers that are smaller than the normal little towns that are on the map, and I'm trying to find some reference to them in here, but I'm not finding them. I'm gonna have to see how they come up. They're these it's a game with far too many different track types for my taste, but these tracks I think represent they're called halting points or something like that. They're basically stops that you don't generate revenue from, but by connecting them up, your corporation gets revenue. You're also going to have multiple kinds of money. The player money and the bank is made up of one type, and then the corporations have their company treasures credits, which means that companies can collect up money as much as they like without affecting the end of game conditions. Remember, XX games tend to end with the possibility of a bankruptcy. This game has a couple of automatic end of games conditions. One is bankruptcy, another is when a stock reaches here, and then there's a final one, which is kind of an interesting. Oh, and then if the bank runs out of money. When I say bankruptcy, I think so the bank running out of money, this going here. Player bankruptcy is usually an issue, but I don't think it's one in this game. Instead, what there is the formation of the Southern Railway coming into the area and then becoming nationalized, and that's going to trigger an end of game type of situation, which gets kind of funky. So the game starts off with the auction of the private companies, as is usually the case. And we got these 4, and then what else? We're also going to have the director's shares of the IOW and C&N up for a kind of auction. But the auction here is different from any other XX auction. What's going to happen is, starting with the first player, whoever's sitting on the priority deal, which we're going to put all the way over here for now, and going around, everybody's got a right to bid. And that's the amount of money they want to spend to have the right to pick and buy one of these 4 things. Or 6, no, sorry, 7, 6 different resources. 4 of them are private companies, or shipping companies in this case, and 2 of them are corporate presidency charters, or card certificates. Once you win the right to buy one, then you pick one of them and you pay its base cost. So in these cases, you'd pay the base cost equal to the item itself. And, well, you know, if nobody bid, whoever has the priority gets to do this. If you want, you could also start one of these corporations. I believe, yeah, whoever wins an auction, the next player in order gets the priority deal and gets to start the next auction. So it doesn't have that weird sort of complicated situation where you don't really know what's going to fall or not. In this case, you could bid on whatever you can afford in here. You're not going to get anything stolen from under you. So you have a lot more flexibility there. But on the other hand, there's some neat little aspects to the normal 1830s, say, stock, private company handling. The final one is this Fishburne Ferry Company out of the private companies, which doesn't even come into play until the 6+3 trains. Yeah, we got complicated trains here. 2+1, 3+2. Those are going to be a combination of big cities and doinkers. And you can use big cities as doinkers in them. We'll see how they work. But that doesn't come available until then. And then in the stock round, whoever has the first opportunity can just buy this thing. This thing has some special effects, so it closes all the other shipping companies, or all the shipping companies, the little privates. The privates aren't going to have the kind of power that they have in an 1830 style game, and you'll see that as we go forward. You can sell them to the bank for £30 less than their base value. And then anyone can buy them during a stock round for base value if they're kicking around in the bank. So if you need to raise capital, you can. You also have the right to exchange four of these for specific shares. For example, this turns into a CNN share, and the bottom CNN share is reserved for this. You don't necessarily have to give them that one, but by getting rid of the shipping company, you can get a share of particular corporations. Each of the major companies has a set of rules pertaining to it. There's the obvious ones, like, say, the IOW. This is their home base. That's where they start. There's no real way to mark that anymore than there were in other XX games. Once there's a track on there, it becomes a little harder than other XX games because it's important actually which one of these is your starting base. So you do have to kind of remember that, and there's not like a map like there was on the back of 56 and 70 that gives you kind of a, hey, you know, here's what the original map looked like in case you need to find things. Gives it information on how many little tokens you have, and these tokens are little wooden circles. I put the stickers on them. You need not, but the thing is, some of the colors of the tokens don't quite match the colors of the stickers. So this is kind of a bluish color. It's got brown. There's another blue that fills the blue ones. Whatever. So having the stickers on seems more advantageous, even if you can't get them on straight, than maybe in some games. Each company has its own par value that it can start at. And the companies actually also, in addition to a home base, have an arrow when they can start. And I'm unfortunately not seeing that right away. There is an optional rule to make them not... Oh, here it is, the layer. So... I think that may be like an 1835 game there, where you can only start a company in layer 2 once these guys are either started or sold out. And we'll see how that works. Those usually piss me off. In 35, I find that very restrictive. But there is an option, an official option, to play it not that way. You might want to play 1835 not that way, too. The overview of the game. This is worth looking at because it explains some of the ideals behind it, although this doesn't try any more than most XX games to be a very strict historical representation. Given where the C&O starts in 1830, you can immediately guess that that's not going to be historical. So it follows the basic 18XX stock rounds and operating rounds, where you're buying up investment shares in the stock rounds and trying to improve your investments in the operating rounds. But at the end of the game, the First World War and the Depression take effect, and that's going to cause the creation of the Southern Railway in 1923. The Southern is going to start consolidating the railway lines in the island and upgrading the engines and rolling stock. Now this doesn't really, you'll see how this works, but it doesn't really, it doesn't absorb them all like the Prussian does in 1835 or the Canadian National does in 56. It just changes the way things are played. And then after the Second World War, the railways on the island become threatened by nationalization of the railways and some other things. Then they'll start closing down, with only the most lucrative companies continuing to run. So during that sort of final shutdown phase of the game, people who maybe overused their companies and took too much cash out of them are going to be penalized, because the people who set up good routes that make a regular income are going to be able to play out a little longer, producing more income and producing more stock value. We have different phases for the different trains. There's an optional 7+4 train that's added in to the deck, supposedly for newbies. I'm not playing with it, probably to my regret, but you know, I don't mind if somebody crashes or has trouble because of that. What are the special things? Well, once you get to the 6+3 train, and you've got all three colors of track going by that point. So the green track comes in on the 3+2, which is the second type of train. The 5+3 brings the brown track in. We've only had one train rust by that point, and the trains per company are at 3 at that point. Well, they drop down to 2 at that point, and the Fishbourne Private becomes able to be purchased. As soon as that purchase happens, all of these disappear. You'd get nothing from them, so you probably want to make sure you get your certificates for them that are in reserve if you can. Then once we get up to the 8+4 train, and there are very few of these kind of higher than the 6 train, right? Until you get to this, where there's an infinite number. There you're going to see not only a rusting of the 5+3, but selling stops reducing share prices, and people can hold as many certificates as they like. That's some very different feelings there. And then after the 9+5 train, the Southern Railway forms, no more track or base building can be made, so you're not going to be placing anything more on the board. And then all companies have at least one train. That's going to trigger the end game phase, and at that point the British Rail is formed, and there's going to be 4 operating grounds between which companies are closed. There's essentially a period where companies start closing. I don't know what that 4 operating grounds point is. I didn't see that in the rules itself. So the game ends in one of 3 ways. I kind of told you about this. A railway company's marker reaches that top score. The bank runs out of money, at which you finish the current operating round, and you hand out fake money until that point. If it happens during the stock round, then there'll be one more operating round at the end of the stock round. And when railways are nationalized, this happens with the sale of the first 9 train, 9+5. Once all the companies under players' directions have at least one train, the railways start being nationalized, and they start, after they will all run and pay dividends, and after each round, 2 or maybe even more companies just get closed by the directors of the British Rail. This continues until all but 2 companies have closed, and then the game will be over. Okay, what's funky? So at the end of the game, you get your cash on hand, the value of the private companies as listed here, plus the stock value of your company shares. Now the stock in this game is going to be on what looks like basically a linear track, but it acts very similarly to the 1830 track. It looks like it's going to be as kind of dangerous as the 1830 track as opposed to the 1829 or 35. 35 has a 2-dimensional, chart to handle the prices of the stocks, but it acts very, very mellow, whereas 29 has a 1-dimensional and it also acts kind of mellow. This will have a more, I think, a more volatile stock market price, because selling stocks dumps their price heavily, which is one of the key factors for me. Doesn't really matter if it's all on a linear chart. During your stock round, you're going to get to do 2 things. Basically, you can sell as many shares as you like, and then you're allowed to buy one. And it's very rigid. And you can't buy back something you sold, just like in most XX games, but there's a little A little fill-up to that, which we'll look at in a bit. Okay. When you sell shares, it depends on the status of the company. If the company has a train, it sells as normal, and what's going to happen is, I believe you go back one space like this. There's a two-tier element to this stock chart, but essentially going back one space means going here for each share sold. So if I sold 3 shares, it would go back like that. And I would get the revenue of what I was in. So this, not revenue, but the stock share value. So I would get the share value, 54 bucks a share, and the price would go down. If the company doesn't have a train though, I only get half the amount of money that my shares officially sell for. If I want to buy them back from the bank pool, they still cost the full value. Interesting. And of course we track par values here, which will indicate the initial paying. When you buy shares from the companies, you fully capitalize the company once it floats. It floats at 50%, not 60%. And it gets the entire, 10 times its par value in company treasury. But you can't just fix them wherever you like. You fix the par values within a range. And the earliest corporations have the highest starting par values, which seems a little strange to me. It's often hard to get a company going late in the game, in an 1830 game, for example, if you start the stock value low. But maybe the trains look a little more smooth here. We're not seeing any big $1,100 diesel. Other sides of it are kind of similar. However, there doesn't seem to be a limit to how many shares can be in the bank. In fact, it doesn't seem to be a limit to how many shares players have to hold. So if I have the presidency, I can drop the presidency. If now you get the presidency because you have 2 shares and nobody else does, well, you can sell those shares. There's no real harm to that. So there's no real raping and dumping of companies available in this. People can bail out of the company when someone else does something terrible to it. So investing in other people's companies is probably fairly safe. Interesting. There's also no great penalty for holding companies, for holding shares in a company that's kind of gone into the toilet. You're not going to have to pay for a train or anything like that out of pocket. There may be problems with being invested in a company that's not doesn't have a good future, but that's something different. There is a certificate limit, however. You're in 4 players only allowed to hold 16 certificates up until a certain point in the game. There does not seem to be a limit on a per company basis. It looks like you can hold 100% of a company if you wish. Again, some of these changes are very much kind of on a realism basis. Like, so it doesn't really make sense that there would be, 19th century economical games representing kind of an antitrust type situation seems pretty unbelievable to me. Railroads could be privately owned and large, at least in theory. Okay. Companies float when they have 50% of their stocks bought from the initial public offering. Shares that are in the bank pool will not count towards this total. I'm assuming if you sell them back to the bank pool, they're not gonna. You're gonna still need to have 50% among the players. I think that's what they're trying to say. When the company starts, you get your normal. And wow, some of the components on this are really good. Like these guys are really nice, thick card stock. Although mine got a little bent from kicking around in somebody's stuff for too long. But you get one of these, you get your little tokens on it, and now you have room for treasury and trains, just like in all the games. And like I said, you'll get 100% of the IPO value someone's holding on to it. Okay, at the start of the operating round, if you have a private company, you get the revenue from it. That seems to be all they do. There's no special rules on them. You can't sell them to your corporations. They are just a fair payout, as far as I can see. Now let's take a look at the flotation and buying companies, because I'm trying to see when you can buy the director's share to something. So phase 3, more companies are now operating. So I'm guessing that the layer is matching the phase, which to me means in phase 2, you're in layer 2 or not. That is not absolutely clear to me how these link together, and I've not been able to find that. Phase 5, this signals a period of consolidation. This phase starts with, yeah. See, I'm not at all sure how these work. Players may initially only buy shares for companies in Layer 1. Once a company within Layer 1 has sold out or operated, Layer 2 is then available, etc. I guess, okay. I don't know what they mean about then with this, that more railway companies are now operating. What the hell? You know, I guess it's just a historical note. So yeah. So as soon as a phase 1 is sold out or has run, people can start buying phase 2, and so on for phase 3 and 4 as the other phases. So you actually don't even need to start all the companies in one layer to play the next layer. That's kind of interesting. Okay. We were back here. Operating your public company. You know what? There's no harm in me taking a break, because I now do the processing over on the YouTube side. So I'm going to take one. Let's pick this up with the operating rounds. You have a pretty normal set of operations here. Lay an upgrade track, buy an additional base, run your trains for revenue. You can either retain the revenue or pay it out as dividends. Buy one or more trains from the bank. And then here's a new one. You can declare your company insolvent. Okay. For the most part, pretty standard 18XX here in terms of laying track. You go from yellow. You can upgrade yellow track to green as long as you keep the pieces there. Green to brown. But, whoa, some of this track's pretty weird. That looks like you're trying to make leopard spots. There's a lot of different track pieces here. If you look at the manifest, it looks like some of your familiar ones are missing, and you got some new weird ones. And then you've got the upgrades, many of which are based by the city. That's going to be kind of complex to figure out what you're doing with those. Empty hex has to be plain track with no stations. A single village has a choice between either putting a small station. Now, a small station is either going to be, those are halts. I'm looking for one with small stations. A small station, these dots are small stations, and these black lines are small stations. When you run your trains, halts and small stations work kind of the same way. Basically, you can use your little number, your plus number, to hit those and to score them. Halts are a little different from small stations. Small stations can be endpoints on your run. Halts cannot. And halts don't produce actual revenue, but they produce a bonus for your company. Basically, you haven't upgraded that town. No one's upgraded that town to the point where it is really an important place where revenue can be gained. However, the government's willing to help. 2 villages is 2 halts or 2 small stations, or 1 of each on the piece. Towns are an empty black circle. You must have, that's 1 of these, you must have one of your big full major station markers on it. Okay. Some special rules on the upgrade tiles. I may screw these up as I'm going. I'm not going to go through them now. But the terrain is more complex than most XX games, as noted by these red things and whatever. So, like 1870 and some other games, you can lay up to 2 yellow tiles or upgrade 1 tile from yellow or green to the next level up, green or russet. And the upgrades, I believe, work similarly to others, but there's a little difference here. You're not allowed to lay track in this game if you can't run a train to it. That's my recollection of it. When tracing qualified track, you cannot trace past a large station that has no spaces with no tokens on it, none of which belong to the current company. Basically, we're used to track, well, no, that's correct. That's the same as 30. The composition of the sentence was confusing, but yes, you have to be able to run a train on it physically. I don't know, though. I seem to remember that you have to be able to run a train that can get there. And that's the wording of this. In order to upgrade a tile, the company must be able to trace a route with one of the trains it currently owns from any of its bases on the board to the tile in question. This is a little different. Yellow track you can lay without being able to trace to it, but upgrades, you have to actually be able to run on that track in some way. Now, how harshly you want to decide on that, I don't know. I think you should be able to fight your way into a town that way, so you don't have to require there to be a live endpoint to the track that you're building, but I'm not sure the way that's worded. At the very least, you have to have a train that can go past the last stop that you hit. Thereby, you can't just be building track on speculation in the yellow and green variety, and that's our brown and green variety. The yellow you can, and you have to add additional track which the company would be able to run one of its trains or increase the revenue of a halt or station. That's the other restriction, is you've got to be able to, if it increases your value. A company without a train thus can't upgrade track. And then you're allowed to buy your bases. Bases in this, you get your starting base for free. The next one's 40 pounds, and after that there are, I believe, 100 each. I'm sorry, they're not pounds, they're company credit. 100 company credit each until you run out of tokens. Okay, actually running your trains, here the game gets very different as well. Tether off. Okay, so you have to start and end in a large or small station. You can't stop. You can't end you can't have an end point in a halt. The ride pier, which is a special piece, will count as a large station. You have to go through one of your base tokens. At least one run for the company has to include the town occupied by the home base token. So the IOW has to run at least one train through here. You can't kind of move your whole corporate, you know, transport capability outside of that area, and it gets worse than that. The next run must intersect with the first run at a station, either a large station, small station, or a halt, and then each further run must intersect with previous runs in a similar way. A route run by a train must follow a continuous line of track shown on the tiles and board. Yeah, that's normal. A route run by a train which enters a hex may not exit it from the same hex side. Once it leaves the hex, it may not re-enter the hex. Now there's an option to make up for that, but that means this track you could only use one of these little loops for. And that's gonna, I may just screw that up and have to dump that roll. Like I said, there's an option to remove it. I'm gonna try to play with it because that's obviously how it was intended, but geez, that's gonna be tough to remember. And trains must call at all large stations on the route. Now, one of the trains run by a company is allowed to pass through a single, completely tokened out station. A station that everybody's blocked out to you, you're allowed to pass through one of those out of all such possible situations on the map each turn. That's weird. But you can't be blocked the way you can in mini games. You can bypass halts and small stations and just ignore them. If you include a halt in the run, you get no regular revenue, but you'll get 10 company credits, regardless of whether you pay out or swallow. You get the revenue from the small routes. And remember, it's the plus sign on the train. Those are free bonus extra hit small doinkers and halts with those. You can also use your big number for that, but it's definitely a more complex way of purchasing, of running the trains here. Okay, and then you add up the value of all the stations that you hit, and you will get an amount of cash, which you can either take as company credits or pay out as dividends, with each share getting 10% of the dividend total. Important note in this one, in most XX games, if somebody points out, especially an investor, hey, you can make more money going this way, you must do it. You don't have to in this. You could say, screw you, man, I'm going home. No. Most importantly, you might want to do it because halts can give you those company credits. You probably would not normally want to weaken the value by running low intentionally. But there may be reasons you do want to, in particular the share price situation. Normally, you'll be going forward 2 spaces for paying out, which means you move directly to the right. If you don't pay out, you move directly to the left, 2 spaces back. Okay. But a little different. If you pay out an amount that is less than your current share value, the total amount of the run is less than your current share value, you don't go forward. Now, that's pretty hard to do, right? You know, if you're at 54, that means you couldn't hit these 2 cities at 30 each. But it puts a real limit on, you know, sometimes companies start out and they have almost no profitability, but their stock value just keeps incrementing. That's not going to happen in this game. Another. I forgot to mention this thing. When you're selling stocks, if you're in the red zone, either on the very valuable or very unvaluable side of the board, you ignore the first share that's sold. But anyway, going back to the operating. If you pay out at least twice as much as your company is worth, you move forward 2 spaces. 3 times as much, 3 spaces. 4 times as much, 4 spaces. This is something I really loved about 1829. I discovered it kind of by accident. I didn't recall the rule the one time I was playing the game, but somebody pointed out, hey, you're supposed to go up this many times. And I'm like, wow, there's the whole game. You know, that's the whole point of the game. Keep your stock value low so you can invest in it and then hit all at once with a big build. We'll see if I can manage that. Because there wasn't a hell of a lot else to 1829 to make it an interesting game, but there looks like there's a lot in this. Okay. What about buying trains? You got to buy them in order. You can sell. You can buy them from another company, but here's the restriction: any agreed upon price, but the selling company can't be left without a train if the buying company already had a train, basically. So you can't strip a couple of trains off a company and make it unviable in the hopes of dumping the stock. On the other hand, dumping that stock's probably not going to be terribly valuable to you because its stock value just dropped by 50%. Because you got rid of the last train off of it. So there's a lot of things in play here to prevent you from being able to rape a company the way you are in the normal 1830 style games, which is interesting. We have your normal rusting, and it's following that chart that I showed. We'll have to dig that up as we go. Hey, here it is. Another copy of it. Okay, if a company doesn't have a train on it, it has to buy one from either the bank, the initial office, or another company. If it has the money. If it doesn't have the money, it doesn't have to buy it. And it becomes insolvent. It gets a little insolvency marker. And what that's going to mean is what? It has to swallow a return. It's not allowed to spend any money on upgrading track or base tokens. It must buy the first train from the bank that it can afford unless it can buy one from a player. Which it does not have to do. You can't be forced to buy from another player. Now, what made it insolvent? If it doesn't have a train. Yeah. So the insolvent company makes revenue, or doesn't make normal revenue. It makes company credits by leasing its track to other people, essentially. But this isn't handled, you know, it's abstracted away. You're going to get 40 company credit plus 20 per large and small station halt that the smallest, cheapest train in the bank pool could possibly have hit. You don't have to actually run the train and count up the full income. There's options to make that more complex or less complex. One side of it is simplified. You don't bother counting up how many places they can hit. You just give the maximum for the type of train. The other is... I'm not seeing it. Original insolvency. It runs the lease train for half the revenue that the train would have made. In this case, though, I'm going to try playing it with the base rules for this second edition game. I think they should work fine. They simplify the thing. Okay, the other way is, if there's no director to a company, it is in receivership. And that means the company will not lay track. It will build any bases. It runs its trains for the maximum possible revenue. The players have to agree. And then retains the revenue in credits. If it doesn't have a train on its turn, it's also insolvent and affects as though it's insolvent. As soon as somebody buys enough certificates that they can trade in for the director's share, it stops being in receivership. Okay, I'm gonna take another pause because I gotta process this anyway. Okay, just a couple more little things here. Turn it off. I don't know the video, but when the first 9 plus 5, 3 plus 5 train is bought, the Southern Railway will be formed. And companies only have to the end of the current set of operating rounds to build more track or bases. Starting with the following, from the start of the following stock round, no track can be later upgraded and no more company bases can be placed. From this stock round onward, halts are no longer counted in company runs. Companies continue to operate, but they only run their trains, pay dividends, and retain revenue, and buy or sell trains. Stock rounds will still occur, though. After the Southern is formed, players can check at the end of each stock round and operating round to see if railways have been nationalized or not. The check is only made at the end of each round, so no checks are made during the rounds. If all the companies which players control, i.e. they're not in receivership, have at least a train each, then a railway will be nationalized immediately into British Rail. I'm sorry, the railways, Southern Railways. In other words, when all companies which have a director have at least one train at the end of a stock or operating round, then the British Rail will be formed, and this train triggers the end game conditions. Play will continue after this operating round, but there will be no more stock rounds in the game. The bank is going to be infinite in size from now on. You can't break it, and you may have to keep track of people's money on paper, which some people would do anyway. During each operating round, any private companies that are still open pay out, if that's possible. This one will be open. And I mean, it is possible these guys could still be open, but very unlikely, right? No, the 9+5 train had to have come out. So those guys can't be there. Any private companies still open pay out, and then each company runs its trains, pays dividends, and adjusts its share price. When it runs its trains, it only counts the first number as the total stations it can visit. Each company director calculates the maximum revenue each company under his or her control can make, and this will be marked on the track here. I'm not sure what you'll be using for that. There may be an extra token for that in each case. Chances are that revenue is not going to change, but if you buy a new train, it might. Companies in receivership pay nothing to their shareholders, and their share price will drop as normal. It's not worth bothering with working out the revenues for these companies. Remember, there's not going to be a stock round, so nobody's going to get that presidency at that point. Companies can buy additional trains if they can afford it, but any trains they buy have to be from the bank, and they can't retain revenue. They have to pay out. At the end of each operating round, the two companies which paid the lowest dividends stop operating. Their share prices will stay unchanged for the rest of the game, and the shareholders gain no more revenue from these companies. If two or more companies paid the same dividend, including nothing, and one has to cease operating, then all companies making that same revenue cease operating. If there are any companies in receivership, these will be the first to close. Strikes me that if there's any in insolvency, they'd be the first to close, but I don't know about it receivership. I'm feeling like that may actually be a typo, and I'm probably going to play it as such. When only one or two companies are left in the game, these one or two companies operate one last time, and then the game ends. All players total their assets, cash and shares, but not company credits. And I assume if they have their private, the private company is valued at face value. If at any time the British Rail forms, a company's share price reaches the top stock market, then the game would end at the end of the current operating round, just as if it was the normal play of the game. Okay. One last main rule, which is bankruptcy. If companies drop down into here, they become bankrupt. In some games, like 1856 and 70, that makes the company disappear and it's gone from the game with all its dots. Not the case here. When they become bankrupt, all their shares are returned to the IPO without any compensation, and now they're available for sale again, starting with the director's share. The company's shares become available for purchase at the start of the following stock round. The company's bases stay on the board, but they're turned over. They'll restrict other companies' track development, but not prevent trains from running through those tokens. The bankrupt company's treasury trains and unused base tokens are kept with the company's charter, available for use by the next director of the bankrupt company once it's refloated. If a phase change occurs between the bankruptcy and the company's reflotation, this means that some of the trains held by the company have rusted. The bankruptcy markers over here are provided to put on the certificate to indicate the corporation's bankrupt and that you shouldn't be doing stuff with it. Whether the bankruptcy occurred in a stock or dealing round, the priority card goes to the person with the fewest shares, not certificates, shares, not including private companies. If there's a tie, it goes in priority order. Now, if the bankruptcy happened in a stock round, that stock round ends immediately, and now there's a new stock round that starts with the new priority. And these people can buy companies as if it's a completely new stock round. They don't have to worry about what they sold in the immediately preceding one. But if they sell shares in the new round, it's as if they sold shares in any stock round. If the bankruptcy happens in the middle of operations, it just means that the next stock round is going to start with a new priority player. I don't know where the priority, there it is. A new priority player based on this recent collapse. Kind of an interesting and weird situation. The big neat thing here is it's not that the company's really, like insolvency is no train, it means you can't meet your obligations. That's usually why things got called bankrupt. But here the stock value somehow got tanked. And you're unable, the company still has assets, etc. available, but people have to rebuy the shares for it and invest in it anew. And that's kind of a weird and interesting sort of situation. Okay, players can make deals with each other, but these have to be known to all players and they're not binding. Game assets may not be transferred or traded between players, i.e. you're not going to sell a private company in this game. There's no rules for it, except back to the bank. Shareholders in a company can ask the director to reveal the company treasury to them. The director has to reveal this. I guess it's going to be open. Non-shareholders cannot make this request. However, if all players agree at the beginning of the game can be played with open money on the corporations. This is, however, a game where it looks to me like all transactions, except maybe the purchase of train between companies, are open and known. So some people believe you should be able to track it throughout. I'm okay either way. Players must reveal their personal cash holdings if asked by another player. So that's definitely open there. So I guess, yeah, the one thing that could be secret is when you transfer money for the purchase of a train, and that is why corporate treasuries aren't open. Everything else is open, though. Different optional rules here. The other side of the board, and you can't ignore small stations, but you can ignore halts. The originally insolvency, we went through this already. You get half the revenue the train would have made that you're borrowing. Simplified insolvency, you make the maximum that that kind of train could make, regardless of what your on-board presence is. Ignoring historical order of companies, you can start them whenever the hell you like. These guys are still in the initial offering, though, so that kind of changes things a little bit. But only 2 companies may be started each stock round unless at least one of them is sold out. So they still try to keep the layering. They just don't bother with the particular ordering of that layering. Selling shares in non-operating companies. When selling shares in companies that have not yet operated, they're sold for full price. Once the company starts operating, though, they go to half price. This allows people to kind of help float a company and then dump it or whatever like that. I'm happy with if it doesn't have a train, it's still a kind of speculative venture. It makes sense to me. Reuse of hexes. This allows you, again, an option to whip around through all of these as long as you're not running over the same piece of track twice. That can be kind of dangerous because it doesn't actually specify here, but there are cities that might have multiple entrances, for example this one, and it doesn't specify this, but this is normal for XX, is, well, if I run through this city this way, I can't run through it again that way. I can only hit each city once. That should be better clarified for the optional. Otherwise, you're still playing something that's not quite the normal XX. But I'll try to play with you can't hit the same tile twice. I don't know how well I can, with a single train, I don't know how well I can do that, because a tile like this could be so important for maneuvering, but I'm likely to just forget it. Variant destinations. Okay, this is an interesting one. So each company is going to have destination towns shown over on the company table. And this isn't going to help you much, but I'll show you an example. We have towns listed here. If you hook up those towns, on the first operating round where you run either a single or connecting routes between the company's home base and the destination, you get a bonus in cash for that. That's kind of cool. Some other games like 1870, sort of, and 1853 have similar sort of options. 53 makes it a bone. Like your destination is this painful cost that you pay ahead of time and you don't get it back until you hook yourself up. 70 gives you a bonus and a direction towards going in a certain way. This is an interesting idea, and I can see it making the game a little bit richer. I'm going to play it without the options, though, because, well, it looks like it's a game with a lot of neat things going on in it. Does it matter that the stock market is just one-dimensional, essentially, or two-tiered, or however you want to put it? Not really. You know, I don't think so. It gives a little... I've always been a little weird about why the stock market in 1830 was made on a two-dimensional basis. But there was a richness to the stock interactions in that game that wasn't present in the 29 with its flat stock market, because I think when you sold shares, the price didn't go down very much. It went down one space if you sold any shares, like 35. If I'm remembering that correctly. I may be mistaken. So basically, it doesn't matter how you represent the stock market. It's, you know, what the effect of sales are on the market. There were some interesting and complex relationships that could be expressed on a two-dimensional stock market, but I don't feel like they added any particular realism or believability to the situation. I feel like a flat stock market is just as is at least as believable. You know, you could see something that's doing very poorly on the market just tanking. All right, we'll send this up and get it processing, and then I'll be playing fairly soon. I've been dragging my feet for various reasons.